It's 5:07. I will call the Lubbock City Council to order. We're in a specially called meeting tonight in Planning and Zoning Commission. I'll allow Mr. Sawyer to call his meeting to order.
Okay, and we'll call to order the Planning and Zoning Commission for this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Sawyer. We have citizen comments are the first item on our agenda tonight. We have 4 citizens in the room that are going to comment, and we have 2 others, I believe, that provided electronic. Is that right, Ms. Garza?
That is correct, and Kristen Sager will read those comments.
Okay, so we'll start with Ms. Sager. Kristen, if you would read those 2, and then we'll invite the 4 citizens that are here with us to share.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. I actually have 3 that were
3,
submitted.
okay, sorry.
No problem. The first is Nicholas Bergfeld, address 5413 76th Street. Members of the City Council, Planning and Zoning Commission, and Comprehensive Plan Oversight Committee, thank you for the opportunity to provide this public comment. My name is Nicholas Bergfeld. I work as a sustainable economic policy advisor to organizations like the Lubbock Compact, and I live at 5413 76th Street. Today's discussion will likely be focused on the question of signage in our community, and I wanted to make sure an issue of critical importance to the revitalization of Lubbock neighborhoods is not lost. I urge the Council to embrace the involvement of the Oversight Committee. More specifically, please allow Oversight Committee to explore incorporating evidence-based and free market-oriented zoning reforms into the city's new zoning plans. It is not an exaggeration to say zoning reform is the single most powerful tool available to the Council for economic revitalization. Kindig Keast, the city's UDC consultant, is a high-quality firm that is more than capable of adding such reforms if the City Council gives them the green light to do so. The impact on revitalization would be enormous. Zoning reform is more powerful than a $150 million bond raise, and yet is simply policy action that costs nothing to the taxpayer. I'm thankful that many of the members of the Oversight Committee were part of the 2040 land use plan process. What we should all remember about the 2040 plan is that it made multiple critiques about the outdated nature of zoning and land use in older portions of our city, but did not include solutions. The City Council believed that the 2040 land use plan was not the appropriate document for corrective action. This left issues like having too much commercial and retail zoning on major arterials, but 0 inside our neighborhoods acknowledged but unanswered. The Oversight Committee is the living embodiment of the promise that these issues would be addressed in future documents and that the City Council intends to hold itself accountable. Think for a moment, if the Unified Development Code is not the right document, then what city document is? In addition, Lubbock has the appropriate information to choose a best practices approach. Value per acre analysis are commonly used by cities to make an informed choice about zoning reform, and a value per acre analysis of Lubbock was facilitated and completed pro bono by Park Hill Smith and Cooper to be used as a community resource. I've included it with this public comment, and I would welcome the opportunity to discuss its findings personally and with any members of the City Council, but I also know the UDC consultants could likely do a better job than I. There are 3 recommendations that come from these analysis. Increase the number of residential units allowed on a single parcel to 4, and handle issues of parking concerns on a case-by-case basis as they arise. This was how North Tech Terrace was appropriately handled. Allow for light retail and commercial activity in neighborhoods, and yes, even create the possibility of a restaurant inside a home. Allow for new styles of building design that mix residential and retail activity together, called live-work units, into neighborhoods.
Thank you, Ms. Sager.
The next is from Marissa DeWolf, and the address provided is near 94th in Indiana. My family lives in a house on a corner lot, and our driveway is on the side of our lot close to the alleyway fence. Between our driveway and the fence is a small area of grass that is hard to keep green and frankly wasted space. At the beginning of the pandemic, my husband and I decided to lift our spirits and that of our neighbors by building 2 raised garden beds. We painted them and planted one with vegetables and one with flowers. The joy and beauty it brought was amazing. We had flowers on our counter and veggies in our meal that we had grown ourselves, and even had enough to share with our neighbors. Our tiny garden gave us a huge amount of pride and satisfaction, and we have met so many new neighbors. This is my real life example of the kind of local green involvement that brings quality to this life and makes me feel hopeful as our city plans our park's future. When we put When we put in our garden, the last thing on our minds is city codes, and it never occurred to us that we might legally be obligated to remove our gardens because we didn't ask permission, or because a neighbor who only wants to see manicured lawn might report us as a nuisance. Recently learning about these possibilities written into the legal parts of our city makes me feel discouraged when I believe Lubbock can and should continue to grow into a more and more vibrant city. Thinking about the downtown civic park that has ignited so much excitement in Lubbock, I'm asking our city leadership to consider lifting requirements for family and community gardens so that the joy we've experienced with our little green patch might be extended to everyone in Lubbock without worry of legal intervention. Without very specific guidelines to what might and might not be considered a nuisance, this can lead to making one citizen's opinion unfairly influential over another's. Please continue making this language definite or removing the nuisance ordinance altogether. And please consider removing family and community gardens from the limited category and move them to the permitted status. Thank you for all you do and are doing to make Lubbock a great place to be. The last is from Jessica Tuller-Karoom. She did not provide an address. Growing Texas Together is a nonprofit located in Lubbock, Texas to support gardeners, growers, and cooks. After working in this area for several years, I can't tell you the number of people who have been interested in starting a new community garden. I try to make the case often that Lubbock has lots of great community garden resources, but needs more gardeners, and the biggest way to burn out gardeners is to have to deal with city zoning difficulties. There are already enough challenges between water and the West Texas weather conditions. I am invested in protecting the resources that others have built for our community. These community gardens like Guadalupe Garden, Booker T. Washington Garden, Heart of Lubbock, and Lubbock Dream Center Garden. I work hard to also lower the barriers to others who would like to create other community gardens. So therefore, in regards to the Unified Development Code regarding community gardens, 1, this is really an issue from the earlier module, but we like to see community gardens be reclassified from limited to permitted across all base residential zoning types. Community gardens must be embedded in communities themselves, and we should allow them broadly across the city. 2, I'd like to see the requirement for a type B buffer yard as described in section 39.02.013B be dropped from the ordinance entirely, as this creates a prohibitive barrier to the garden that should not be assumed to be implicitly desired by the community in which the garden exists. Additionally, under the nuisance clause of the same section, the need for buffering easement could be addressed if necessary. 3, regarding the nuisance clause of the ordinance, we'd like to see language added that would protect community gardens from arbitrary and excessive harassment from unfriendly neighbors. Such language might include the complaint being required to specifically state the nature of their complaint, the city's codes enforcement department making a judgment on the issue, and adequate time given, 60 days, to rectify a nuisance if necessary.
Thank you, Ms. Sager. Okay, we have 4 citizens who signed up that are with us tonight to offer input. I just remind everyone that like our folks that wrote in, you need to keep your comments pursuant to what we're discussing tonight and to keep them 3 minutes or less. Okay, so we'll start with Joshua Shankles. Mr. Shankles.
Good afternoon, Council. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. My name is Joshua Shankles, and I live at 2604 47th Street. I'm a member of the governing board of Lubbock Compact. I'm a small-scale farmer here in town, and I am leading a series of initiatives on behalf of the Lubbock Compact related to parks, gardens, green space, urban agriculture, and I was investigating the UDC Module 3, and you'll grant me a little bit of forbearance that many of the elements of it that relate to landscaping, parks, gardens, green space refer back to earlier sections of the module. So it's kind of hard to parse this all apart. But to mirror the sentiments of commenters that have already come before you, we see some, we think, non-controversial issues that could maybe be resolved in this to get rid of the barriers that community gardens might face. I'll just quickly recap that. Again, we'd like to see these permitted for use across all zoning types, particularly residential types, because as it stands, they are relegated to rural estate type lots, which are on the perimeters of cities. And as is probably obvious, a community garden needs to be embedded within its community. And so this would be extremely limiting to future gardens, but also could very much impact our existing gardens if they substantially improve their space. Additionally, we'd like to see the buffer yard requirement dropped. As the previous commenter suggested, this could be covered under the existing nuisance clause there if it is even considered a nuisance by its community, which it's embedded within. And to the nuisance clause, yes, we'd like to see that have some language that would strengthen the protections of these vital community assets that are enhancing the quality of their neighborhood and protecting them from maybe some aggressive neighbors. I would hasten to say that we've already received some invitation to consider this, but I would like to put it in front of all the various committees overseeing this process to see that this is carried through to its end. I would additionally hasten to say that these community gardens that I'm proposing, we will have a need in the future, given that the USDA suggests we will need to grow 60%.
30 seconds left.
Is that we will need more of these, and that means they need a space to go, and that means we need zoning reform that creates open public green space within our communities. And while I see a lot of language related to new development and how that might be accomplished, I don't see a lot of language or policy that would accomplish this for older neighborhoods. Indeed, I would hasten to say, in speaking to one of the consultants
Mr.
last night.
Mr. Shankles, excuse me, up here, your time is up. We don't have a bell today, but your
Okay.
time is up.
Yeah, I was right on
Finish
the
your,
edge. Thank you
finish
for
your
starting.
thought, Joshua.
My thought is that we could add language in here that would facilitate the creation of gardens and green space within our older communities. And we should, because they will be necessary as we become more dense and as we modernize our city. I think we'll all appreciate that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Shankles. Next is Terry Holman. Terry?
Good evening, Mayor, members of the council, Chairman, Planning and Zoning Commission members. I'm Terry Holman. I reside at 4492nd Street. I'm speaking this evening a little bit on the behalf, not necessarily of the Developers Council, because they, as a group, have not authorized me to speak, but we have a subgroup within our Developers Council that has been looking through this code with a very close eye. And I wanted to kind of touch on a few things this evening. First of all, the members of our little subcommittee are myself, Chris Berry, Corey Doolin, Mont McClendon, and Jordan Wheatley. So our little subcommittee is a pretty good cross-section of our development community who are the most impacted by this exercise. And so we take a lot of interest in these discussions. And I want to say that we have been included in the discussions. I want to say thanks to the planning department staff as well as the consultants. They have been forthcoming with us. We've had a lot of very productive open discussions, and we're going to continue that. We have, as a group, we have only had a chance to provide vetted feedback on modules 1 and 2. We just recently got 3. I have gone through all of module 3, but I've not had a chance to review it with our little group and provide that feedback. So to be fair to the consultants, some of what I may say tonight, they haven't even heard from us yet. Okay, so but I'd like to get some things out just for food for thought. Some of our initial concerns with respect to modules 1 and 2 was newly annexed land comes in as RE zoning, which frankly is a zoning district that I don't think any of our residential developers will ever do. If you want to do 2-acre lots, you're moving out to the county. So that's a technical thing that we might ask folks to look at. Any zoning district that was prior R2 or A1 gets transitioned over to semi-urban planned, which means that if you have any property that's currently zoned to allow for duplexes, that then by default triggers it to be a planned development, which by the way is defined in module 3. And so we hadn't yet really had a chance as a group to vet that. So we would ask that some consideration be put to that. With respect to building setbacks, there was really, we've spent a lot of time talking about residential setbacks, and we created this R1A zoning district. A lot of those types of things did not make it into the current modules 1 and 2. And to be fair, we did have a pretty good long page turn with the consultants in the planning department. And I think they realize that, and they've been very open to listen to our
30
concerns.
seconds.
Thank you very much. Module 3, my comments are that we feel like some of the landscaping is very onerous for new retail, and we want to be on the lookout for that. We agree the code needs to be updated. We don't see an urgency in that. The way we've been operating is working. It needs to be repaired, but maybe not as an urgency. Lastly, we all are facing impact fees. Please let us all, the private side and your staff, get through
Time.
June 1, and then we can tackle this with a little more fervor. Thank you very much.
Mr. Holman, let me ask you a question. So what would be on that last comment you made? Elaborate on that for just a minute, please.
So when impact fees were passed by council, the effective date of the ordinance became June 1st.
Right.
We, on the private side, the developers and the consultants are scrambling to do as much as we can to get as much of our development in place prior to that June 1 deadline. That just buys us a 1-year reprieve on impact fees. Not only us, but I'm sure your planning department staff and your engineering staff come about May are going to be loaded up with this work. And so we just have some big things converging all at once. And I would ask for just some consideration.
So a process that might not finish till the fall would be okay with you then in that regard? Just
in terms of this?
Yes.
My answer to that is we would rather get it right than get it quick.
I think we agree. Okay, thank you. Just want to make sure
Thank
just want to get clarification on that.
Thank you.
Okay. Next is Mary Vines. Ms. Vines?
Good evening, members of the council and the planning commission. What I'm wanting to speak to is a very small part of what will be covered in UDC presentation this evening, but I came yesterday evening to the poster presentation and stood for a while in front of the poster that talked about signs and tried to decipher some of what that meant, and went away really confused because I knew that the expert or the consultant didn't have time to try to explain to me in a way that I could understand exactly what all of that chart meant. So I went today to my computer and pulled up that online and read through it and came away still confused because it is written in words that don't speak to my visual understanding of how something will look actually on the ground. And what I'm saying tonight is that I hope, my expectation or my hopes for this meeting is that if you don't already understand how it will look on the ground, that you will have a better understanding when it talks in the part that deals with signs about where no sign permit is required. And there are lots of possibilities that just boggle my mind, quite frankly, on what all is permitted. And I have no idea what that would look like on the ground. And I hope that if you're like I am and don't understand, that maybe we'll go away with a better understanding after tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vines. Finally tonight, John Zwiker. Mr. Zwiker.
Thank you all for allowing me to come up here today. I want to also compliment you on all the work you've done. I'm here as the chairman of the comprehensive plan Oversight Committee, which I have members here, Bernie Bass, Billy Russell, and our own Dan Wilson is on that committee. And I may have missed anybody else that may have been on the committee today. We have gone through this, as you know. Part of the oversight is reviewing this wonderful plan that, frankly, the Unified Development Code, and it's a compliment to everybody that's working on this. A couple of things have come out of it on our oversight committee. We feel like we have some ownership in this as we go through it, which we do. Some of us who are on the committee also served on the 2040 plan. So we're excited from the standpoint that we're getting closer and closer on what we need to do. Two areas that came in discussion on our last committee meeting that we wanted to re-emphasize to all of y'all up there is two things: was the mixed use zoning districts, or how we're going to apply these mixed use areas that are available. It's also in the code, and not being an expert on it. We're talking about existing neighborhoods. Take East Lubbock, North Lubbock, Barnett Benson, area between 19th and 50th on each side of Indiana, all the established neighborhoods. We feel like that it needs to be emphasized that this mixed use is available and is also used to the best ability in these neighborhoods. We feel that even light retail can be very beneficial in neighborhoods when houses become available that maybe need to be upgraded. When we grew up, zoning was, if you didn't like something on a house, there was 18 for sale signs in the front yard, and it was taken care of by the local people on each block. But we need to make sure that y'all understand, and we know you do, the seriousness in our committee that this is addressed, and it's provided, and it's understood and encouraged more than anything else. Second thing is the zoning in East Lubbock, and we spent a good amount of time on this, particularly in East Lubbock, where the neighborhoods are butt up against industrial, in fact, high industrial areas. As you know, when we did the 2040 plan, we had meetings extensively, huge turnouts concerning those parts of town, and how if something came up that can be done, it needs to be emphasized that if these industrial zoned areas and something happens and the business leaves, for instance, that it's not continued to be zoned that way. And it's a detriment to the neighborhoods that's existing there. Okay. Because we know there's also been some discussions about hazardous materials that are left over in these areas. And it's very important. In fact, it was a big part of our last meeting. We discussed this. So we want to re-emphasize to y'all that this is an important factor that needs to be considered when you do this. And a lot of times in these codes are really addressed in new areas too. It's a big emphasis on the new areas. But we want to make sure that this code is really paying attention to the existing areas in this. Any questions on our oversight committee? I'll be happy to answer any on that.
I think we're thankful for your work and for your input. Both are duly noted. We very well may call you back for questions at some point later tonight.
Well, I have a baseball game at 6, so hurry up and ask me.
Are you still playing shortstop, or have they moved you to DH? Oh, okay. I was just checking to see. I just want to know what position you're playing. Don't get testy with me up here. Okay, coach. All right. I think that concludes citizen comments for the evening. It's good to have Mr. Zwiker here and providing a little spice to our meeting. We'll go to number 2 on our agenda tonight. Our only other item is to hold a meeting with the P&Z, as we've talked about earlier, and to hear presentation from staff and from our consultants, Kendon Keast, on Module 3 of the Unified Development Code. To get that started, I'd like to call our Director of Planning, Brian Isom, to the microphone. Mr. Isom.
Good evening, Mayor and Council, Planning and Zoning Commission, and guests that are joining us both in person and virtually. We'd like to welcome everyone to our site visit for Module 3. As you all know, in 2018, we adopted the Plan Lubbock 2040, our comprehensive plan, the first comprehensive plan effort in 30 years. One of the items that came out of that, the CPAC identified priority recommendations and implementation strategies to help achieve the goals of that plan. One of those priorities that we'll be talking about today was to adopt a unified development code, which you'll hear referred to as a UDC throughout tonight a lot in the future. What this document does is combines all of the development regulations for a city into one essential document instead of having to go find it in different parts of our ordinance. In addition to supporting the implementation strategies of the comp plan, the adoption of a UDC would support the 2021 City Council priorities as well, specifically including community improvement, growth and development, as well as economic development and redevelopment. Previously, our consultants have presented and discussed modules 1 and 2, and tonight they will present module 3. This third module, not completely comprised of, but the majority of items are covered under site design, landscape requirements, sign regulations, floodplain and Playa Lake regulations, and subdivision standards. So with that, I'd like to introduce our consultants, Kende Keast Collaborative. We have Brett Keast and Brian Mabry, and I believe Brian is going to kick the presentation off.
Good evening and welcome back.
Thank you. And thank you, Brian, and good evening to everyone who's here to hear us talk about this important step forward in this overall project. It's kind of been said, but just to give you more of a visual maybe about the overall process for this project. We started some time ago with several background kind of fact-finding activities, talking to people locally because they and you all are the experts because you live here and this is your city. And we talked to them and gathered information and used our own perspectives as national zoning writers and code drafters to do a critique of your existing regulations, which was presented in a forum very much like this, a different building, but very similar situation. Had several public activities known as charrettes, where some of our sub-consultant partners worked to do some urban design style activities and plans and drawings to show how the regulations could impact the city in the future once adopted. And then we moved on into the true hardest work and the majority of the work of a project like this, which is drafting the regulations. And for all of our projects, but especially this one, we draft regulations in a very iterative process. And by that, I mean, we provide, before you ever see a word on a page or on the screen, we provide a draft to the staff to go through very particularly and finely to help us get it right. And they provide us comments back. We provide them another draft that they look at, and then they end up sending to you all to review. You provide comments in a forum like this, and we take that back and we hit that module one more time and do edits to it. So for 4 modules, it's that back and forth. And again, we're on the 3rd module now, so we've been doing it for a while, and it gets better each time. So I think that's something important to note, so that it's as customized to this city as it can possibly be. We also, as part of each of our trips here to talk about our work, have an open door style meeting, which we've had last night, and have had a few for previous modules as well, where we put the posters up, have people come and talk about what their thoughts are, have them write on Post-it notes, and we put it on there so that we'll remember what people's concerns or questions or comments were on what we happen to be working on at the time. Finally, further down the road, I've kind of caught us up to where we are now on module 3. Module 4 will have review procedures in it. So how a person would get approval for a rezoning or a variance or a specific use permit, and some other provisions about enforcement of the UDC and nonconformities, how those are treated, things like that. Eventually, we will get to the point of public hearings where the Planning and Zoning Commission will hold a public hearing and provide a recommendation to the City Council about adoption. And then it is in the city council's court to make that the final decisions about what is going to be in the content of this UDC, and then it's finally adopted as law and goes into effect. So that's sort of a tour of the process that we're looking at and that we've been going through and what lies ahead. There are some goals for this project, and they've kind of been stated by Brian already. But implementation of the comprehensive plan is a huge goal of any project like this. UDC and the zoning regulations and development regulations that go along with it are the tools, pretty much to. I mean, there are others, but they're very important tools to accomplish the policies that are in your comprehensive plan. And so this is along with your new comp plan. This is a very monumental project. Another goal has been to do the critique and do an annotated outline, and we've worked through that and are using that to guide our work on these modules. And of course, the goal is to give you a unified development code that has a consolidation of your existing regulations along with some new ones and some modified ones that are easier to read, easier to understand, more illustrated, and easier to use online than what you have now. So that's the guideposts for what we're working with. It's already kind of been said what Module 3 consists of, and showing that on the screen. So I won't spend a whole lot of time on that, and it shows what the previous and future modules will consist of, which I've gone over. This is a kind of very fine print, but it shows a lot, but it gives a recap of what was in Module 1. Just to refresh your memories, it's been a while since we've talked about Module 1. Module 1 contains all your zoning districts, your big land use table that shows what land uses are allowed in what zoning districts. It establishes your zoning districts. It has various development types in there, which we can talk about, and that we have talked about with Module 1, but sort of conventional development, clustered development, where more open space is set aside in exchange for getting to have more lots in the subdivision, and then the planned development type, which is similar to cluster, but in a more urbanized environment. Module 2, our partners Dover Cole, who aren't, we have Mark White of White and Smith in on our Zoom call for this one. Dover Cole, our other subconsultant partners on this project, are not involved today because they didn't really have any involvement in Module 3. They worked heavily in Module 2 to do the form-based districts for the mixed use districts that are in the UDC, and provided frontage types, which are the frontage of the building, the front facade, and the entryways of buildings, and different styles and design standards for those type of things, and building types, whether it's single family detached, the obvious ones like single family detached or duplex or apartment, but also live work units or kind of corner store type buildings, things of that nature. And it shows in Module 2 which of those mixed use districts those building types are allowed in. So Module 3 has a lot of content to it. If you had a hard copy, it was probably a pretty big stack, but there's a reason sometimes for that, what might seem like wordiness. A lot of times people, have a reasonable goal to want to simplify their standards, simplify their process, and we agree with that. But a lot of times in order to get that simplification in process, you have to spell things out a lot more clearly and articulately than what they were spelled out in your existing regulations. So that could add length if you're looking at it in terms of stacked up sheets of paper. So that's something to note, that when there's more staff authority and when things can hopefully move quicker through the development process, that can mean you have a thicker book because there's more guidance for staff in there. You can have a very short unified development code that says everything requires a public hearing and everything's negotiated out and depends on a vote by the council or the Planning and Zoning Commission, and you'd have a very short, small unified development code. But this is why you might see that it's a rather lengthy document. A lot of material in Module 3. I have sort of a table of contents on the screen that covers pretty much all of the topics that would be in this presentation and that were on the posters last night and that are still out there if anyone wants to provide comments on them. So getting a little bit more into the content, we have purpose statements for all of the topics of Module 3 spelled out. For example, trees, landscaping, and buffering, giving the reasons that the city is adopting standards related to these items. We also have purpose statement for signs. We also have purpose statements for all the other pieces of the Module 3 so that it's clear that there's a rationale and a reason that benefits the public for adopting standards like this. Another part of that is having really much more clear applicability standards. And by that, I mean, when do these building standards or when do the parking standards or when do the landscaping standards kick in? What kind of development activity does someone have to do on their property for those standards to kick in? And they're kind of tiered from small changes kick in a couple of the divisions or the chapters in the UDC, and greater changes require greater compliance with the standards that are in the UDC. And I think that's a great benefit, so that it's really clear what someone is getting into, you know, when they think they might want to do an expansion of their building or do a new building or establish a new land use or something like that. We're now going to talk about parking, and that was a piece that our partners on this module, White and Smith, worked on. And I do believe Mark White from White and Smith is available and ready to speak to that.
Yes, I have Reese Wilson in our Dallas office. Reese principally worked on this section. Reese, you want to share with them, the City Council, what Planning and Zoning Commission?
And just let me know when to advance the slide and I'll do that.
Very good.
Can y'all hear me?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So I'm gonna try and keep this short. I don't know how long we have for this meeting. But the parking and loading regulations are, I think, pretty straightforward. Basically what we did, we looked at was finding ways to reduce parking in the mixed use areas, and commercial areas, to, address overparking situation. And so the main things that we did is provide a table with new parking ratios, and you'll see kind of the metrics. You'll see the metrics of what we're proposing. It's nothing, in my opinion, that's drastic parking reduction. We think it's a little bit more of a right-sized approach to parking in the city. With that being said, we do provide, there's some possible where, there's trying to look at for more walkability and urban view. So we did include some language about parking reductions, 50% parking reductions in the area. So that's something we think that could work well in basic institutional areas to kind of help promote walkability and using other modes of transportation. And to go further into detail, we also provide some required bike parking. So certain developments require bicycle parking spaces, racks or whatever, to help tie in some of the other means of transportation in the area. That's pretty much the main features. Yeah, we'll talk about loading. Nothing too drastic with loading plan. Basically, I know from my previous experience as a city planner, we had a lot of various requests, issues with unnecessary loading spaces requirements. So this is something I kind of looked at with a municipal planner process, finding a way in which we can reduce the need of necessary loading. So with that being said, there's a little table in the UDC that kind of shows what's how many square feet in particular type building, what kind of requirement that is. Of course, we provide some stacking Second lane requirements, this is another issue that not just, that's not another issue that I had with other cities. That we have a lot of spillover from stacking lanes not being regulated effectively. So the restaurant is a very busy restaurant sometimes. The stacking and driving throughout the street and disrupt the ability to traffic. So this is something that we provided stacking lane requirements as related to the plan order. So there's what explain latest terms, visual, kind of look.
I'm going to interrupt you for a minute on that one. So how do you, some of our older parts of town, I think 34th Street is an example. You're not going to be able to provide for that. That's not realistic. Businesses, the lots aren't deep enough. Buildings aren't that far off the road. We don't want them tearing them down and building new boxes there. So how do you deal with that?
So the first thing I would think of is, this is for new development, and we would have something in our work. We have process which non-conforming uses is adopted.
Okay.
I think that'd be a first part of the process.
All right. One more question. And I may be the only guy in the room that doesn't understand this, but what's a bicycle parking place? Are you talking about like a bike rack that would have room for 10 bikes? Or are you actually talking about a parking place?
Yes, it'd be like a bike rack, a bike parking feature.
Okay. All right. Just want to make sure. It didn't say that. It said parking place. And, I'm reading this very literally. It's sort of how we read this kind of stuff. Okay. Thank you. Please continue.
That's pretty much the over the big things in parking part of this module.
Yep. Okay.
They're going to stay with us. So if we have questions in a minute.
They'll stay because they have more slides.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. Thanks, Brian.
Yep. So the next big piece of module 3 is trees, landscaping, and buffering. Currently, your landscaping requirements are really based on percentages of the site, and that's roughly it, generally speaking, citywide. And what we're doing in module 3 is to be a little more precise with that and to have a little bit more precision about where landscaping is going to go instead of just a flat percentage of the site. And so there are 4 types of landscaping that are in the draft. And I should have, the word draft made me remember, please remember everything is a draft until it's adopted and can be changed, just so everyone's clear on that. The first type is foundation plantings, which are plantings at the base or the foundation of a building. And these terms are color keyed and they might not show up as well on the projector there, but the turquoise area of the illustration around the perimeter of the building shows what is meant by foundation planting. Buffer yards are another type of landscaping that Module 3 establishes. And buffer yards are landscaped areas with either fencing or walls or berms, or maybe even if they're wide enough, no fence or wall or berm, but they're of a certain prescribed width on the perimeter of a property, especially where it abuts something that might be a less intense use. Like if this were a shopping center here on the illustration and over to the right, there is a residential development, then there would be a buffer required between the new shopping center, for example, and the established residential area over on the right side of the picture. And I've got a little more detail about buffer yards in a subsequent slide. There's just overall development landscaping, which is kind of everything else other than the parking landscaping, the buffer yards, and the foundation planning. And then, as I said, the yellow indicates the parking area landscaping in the form of like landscape medians or islands that you often see in parking lots.
So
There-
Brian, when I was looking at this this presentation this afternoon, the question I had about this slide, is this to scale or is this just an example?
Oh, totally just an example.
Because
I mean,
it looks
it's-
like a lot of parking for.
It's somewhat to, oh yeah, sure.
Okay.
It's somewhat to scale, but it is not meant to be, maybe we can modify it to give a more realistic look of what the parking would look like on like a
Okay,
office supply store or something of that
Okay.
nature.
thank you.
We do retain the minimum landscape area percentage, so it's still in there, and actually the percentage numbers are should be roughly the same as what they currently are. We had them higher at one point, and getting some feedback, have adjusted those through that process, like I mentioned earlier, of getting feedback and adapting the draft to the feedback. And then there's a break in there, among other breaks for industrial buildings in the light industrial and general industrial, which is your current M1 and M2 districts, saying they don't have to have foundation plantings. If you kind of makes sense for an industrial building not to need maybe that much dressing up as what the foundation plantings would provide. Going a little deeper on the buffer yards. They really allow more uses to be allowed in your use table in more districts than what you would have before, so that instead of worrying that let's say a gas station and not letting it locate next to a residential area, instead allowing that gas station, but under the provision that the gas station provide buffering between itself and the residential use, so that that residential use is, once again, as I said, protected from the negative impacts that something like a gas station could provide. These are really spelled out. There are different widths and amounts of planting in the buffer yards. So if you had sort of just a slightly different uses next to each other, like single family and apartment, that would be one kind of buffer that's maybe skinnier and doesn't have quite as many plants. But if you have a new manufacturing use locating next to a existing residential, then that buffer is much more substantial, wider, and has more plantings located within it. There are options for having a fence or a wall within the buffer. And if you have a fence or a wall, you don't have to provide quite as many plants as you would if you didn't have one. There's also allowances for berms. If anyone wanted to do those, that would allow also for a reduction in the amount of plants required.
Brian, I'm going to interrupt you
Yes,
for 1
yes, sir.
minute.
Yes, sir.
Ms. Patterson Harris has a question. Sheila?
Thank you. Brian, you kind of lost me when you were speaking in regard to buffering for some of those neighborhoods that have industrialized, and you said that it should not require. Well, what was your statement? Maybe I misheard you.
I might have misspoke. I meant to say that let's imagine that there is a residential area and something like a new industrial use wants to locate next to it. That would require a certain width of a buffer that's described in the Unified Development Code, with a pretty hefty amount of plantings in it. Trees, big trees, small trees, and shrubs would be required within that area to help protect that established residential neighborhood from the new, whatever it is, factory or manufacturing use or something.
Okay,
like
thanks
that.
for restating that. That's not what I heard a
Okay,
few
I'm
minutes
sorry
ago
about
when
that.
you were talking. And just to reiterate what Mr. Swiker was saying earlier, I'm really interested in how we address that in some of those older areas where that already exists, or how we can help transition that or whatever. Thank you.
The final thing for the landscaping, trees, and buffer yards part is tree preservation, and want to emphasize that is in this draft optional. The benefit, though, is that you get landscaping credit for preserving any trees that might be on the site. And there's specific guidance and standards in this module that shows yeah, basically the bigger the tree that gets preserved, the more credit you get for your landscaping requirements. So if you just based on the table that you're looking at now, if someone had a tree on their property that was 7 inches, between 7 to 9 inches diameter at breast height, it's a technical term, but basically about this tall, 4 feet, 4.5 feet. If it had that size, trunk, caliper, then it would be good for credit for 3 trees that would have been normally required as new saplings on the new landscaping for that development. So it is optional. It can be used, but it's not mandated tree preservation. Now we're getting into a new part of Module 3, which is signs, and I'll turn it once again back over to the team at White and Smith to talk through this.
Hey, Brian, this is Mark White. I work extensively with Brian and his staff on the sign regulations. What we've done in this quarter of the code is several things. One is we have moved all of your existing sign categories to physical-based categories, things that don't relate to the message conveyed by the sign. One example of how we did that is the incidental sign application. That collapsed a number of different categories that include things like real estate signs and so forth, and give people more flexibility. Consistent with what Brian explained earlier about making the code easier to read and easier to use, we replaced a lot of the long text that you have with tables and things like that that are sort of more summary, easier to use for, and lead the reader right to the numbers that they're interested in. But we also have a tiered approach to freestanding signs. And those are the largest signs, the one that you see in the picture that most people, react to. That's tied to the frontage area. So instead of just a percent or a ratio of the frontage you have today, we have one for less than 300 feet of frontage, you get 50 square feet, 300, 450, you get 20, and so on and so forth. So that scales up, that allows larger signs for larger sites and requires smaller signs for smaller sites. Next slide. And beyond that, those things that I showed you on the other slide, we are trying to maintain fundamentally the basic approach to regulation that you have in your current sign regulations. We're just updating it with some things that were identified for us as we went forward with focus groups and stakeholders, folks interested in signs. So the next slide is shows another thing that was added to provide both some flexibility for multi-tenant buildings and to make sure that because our wall signs are an overall allocation, that one user doesn't grab all the allocation for wall signs and the rest of them are surprised because they don't get anything. So we allow in your public and non-residential districts an allocation of 10% per wall that is attributable to the tenant or the occupant of that space. So as you can see on the left, that archivers, that's 5% of that wall space. The other two are 9 and 7%, which is scaled to the size of that wall. It is an appropriate percentage, and consistent with what a lot of other communities do around the country. Next slide. We also address electronic message display signs, digital signs. It's maybe a way of thinking about it with clear maintenance and hold time requirements. We've had some meetings with focus groups since we did our initial draft. And we initially had 10 seconds, and maybe we have a place today if my memory serves. That was changed to 8, which is consistent with what the Texas Department of Transportation provides, and it's also a very common standard for these things. And the reason for a hold time, of course, is so that the message doesn't just continuously flash on the screen and then drivers are distracted because they're watching a message change as opposed to paying attention to the driver. We also added some pedestrian-oriented categories in your base mixed-use districts, which are designed for a more walkable environment in the city. So those are things like projecting signs, like you see on the left, that would extend out the face of the building wall. Canopy signs like the one in the middle, then A-frame signs like it's common to downtown and Main Street environments. It gives, for example, give them a way to advertise temporary one-time sales or things on their menu, that sort of things. So that allows some flexibility for business owners and others in those environments. Next slide, Brian. And billboards, something that has, this has gotten a lot of attention. And we're still talking this with a lot of focus groups and others. Billboards are identified as a specific use in with the LIGI districts. Now, so it maintains their allocation under the current ordinance. Those districts correspond to where they're allowed today. The Canyon Lakes policy zone at 1,500 feet from the Memorial Civic Center. The basic standards are they have to comply with building code. They're allowed up to 750 square feet and 500 feet apart on expressways, 200 feet apart on other streets, and a height of up to 35 feet. The comparable use determination for your extraterritorial jurisdiction is maintained, and we're using a physical definition of billboards because that's what people think of your billboard. You're thinking about that image on the right, so we've described it more clearly in the definition section. And then finally, next slide, Brian. We are working on a master sign plan process that gives property owners some flexibility. They would submit this concurrent with a rezoning or other discretionary review. It would require an integrated sign package so that the signs are consistent in terms of design and so forth. And that would tag to some small increases in wall sign and freestanding sign height and area allocation. So that's something that in exchange for providing a higher level of design for these incentives for property owners as well. So that ties up signs, and with that, we'll turn it to Alvin Reese, who's going to talk a little bit about
Let's pause before we go and see if we have any questions around signs. Anybody have anything they want to talk about there? I didn't see what I probably call it the wrong thing, but like a large downtown, like a mural type sign. I didn't see that called out in here. Is that is it mentioned in the plan?
Directly, a mural, as it's written in the current ordinance, be considered a wall sign. They're typically painted, so a mural would fall within that application. We did have a meeting this afternoon where that did come up, and so I think for our next rounds, we're at least going to add a definition of murals so that they're at least identified separately, and then they would still fall within that wall sign application. I know there's a committee review process for public art that tag that as well. So that's something that's under discussion right now. But if this draft passes, they would fall within the wall sign application.
I'd like to think that in our central business district areas that we would have a different type of application around potential building signs. The mural type signs. I know that that's not a universally held opinion, but I'd at least like us to consider that, and in a limited part of the community. So I'd like to at least see what that might look like. Ms. Joy, I think.
We did talk about that this afternoon.
Ms. Joy, would you hit your microphone button, please?
Because I can't see you. Okay. We did talk about that this afternoon and talked about it in what will now be the mixed use districts. But we also talked about making it citywide not discriminating against anybody else. And I think what we came up with is something that everyone can live with. We just haven't had time to get it
That's great.
into the drafts, but it has been discussed at length this afternoon.
That's great. I wasn't invited to those meetings. When I was reviewing it, that's something I saw that seemed to beg some kind of discussion. So any other questions on signs? Comments? Okay, please continue.
Reese, were you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Go ahead.
Okay, so we're gonna talk about outdoor lighting. Basically, what we work on here are strengthening standards that kind of promote walkability, ensure people are safe when they're outside walking. Also some visual appeal with lights. And then we're making sure that we're kind of reducing light pollution. I am in Texas and stars are bright, at night. And sometimes we like to see the star. So it's kind of some standards that kind of help protect the environment, giving us some options, right? So basically, this includes setbacks, 5 feet from property line, height requirement, full shielded lights, developments to protect from the glare and pollution over the different directions, and vertical luminance measures, at the bottom right of this slide, which kind of shows what's the acceptable threshold for light pollution in different districts, zoning districts. And that's measured in book methods. So it's a little bit of a different measurement from what we're used to in movements. But this can easily be measured through a lighting measurement device. You get $20 to calculate basically this measures the luminance that happens when you apply this to the light. And that's pretty much it for the outdoor lighting. Any questions?
Questions on outdoor lighting? Okay, thank you, Reese.
Okay, excuse me, shifting gears a little bit. Next is the subdivision standards piece of module 3. What we've been talking about before, the topics of the previous slides have been more about things taking place on a particular property, on a particular development. The subdivision standards, as you might know, are related to laying out a new, just think of it as a new residential subdivision as an example. That's several platted lots, laying out of streets, sidewalks, easements, and those type of things. So it's a different set of standards and a different kind of mind frame than the previous standards that we've talked about. So in the draft, we spell out and say when platting is and is not required. And I just have some examples on the screen of when it's not required, and then pretty much anything other than that, platting is required. And it relies heavily on the Texas Local Government Code, which sets statewide rules for things such as this. But basically on large parcels that already have access to streets, when there's an inheritance, when there's laying out cemeteries, when that happens, since they're all little separate ownerships, I guess, kind of, and then where there are divisions of land by a court order. Many of those, other than maybe the large lot, second bullet there toward the top, many of those are sort of rare. I rarely ran into them when I was on the public side, but basically just trying to be clear of when platting is and is not required. And by platting, I mean when a person draws up a subdivision, an engineer or surveyor draws up a subdivision and submits it as a preliminary plat, and it goes through the review process for the subdivision, and then a final plat and approval and construction and all of those things. So one thing that we've heard several times and tried to do what we can to help out with it, but try to keep standards with standards and procedures with procedures. And so whenever there's a reference in any of these first three modules to a procedure or to a definition or a nonconformity provision, you're not going to be able to see it yet because it's in module 4. And that's because we, again, keep all of the procedural stuff, like how things are reviewed and approved, together in sort of their own corner of the UDC, and conglomerate and consolidate standards, how tall a sign can be, how wide a sidewalk has to be, how much landscaping you have to have, with their kin all together in the other half of the UDC, basically. So there are times where you might not be able to see what we are referring to when we have a cross-reference, but that's the alternative, other than giving you a very large document all at once to review, and that could be rather overwhelming. So we go with the module approach. Your streets are dealt with in the subdivision standards, really as far as the width required and their amenities. We point to the master thoroughfare plan for where they would be located and how wide they would be, how much paved width, sidewalk placement, and things of that nature. As properties develop, then if they are in close proximity to a projected new street on your thoroughfare plan, then there are things that have to happen where the subdivider dedicates land and builds a portion of the new street to serve the development. So we're just pointing to the thoroughfare plan for a lot of that. We updated the terminology in the UDC. Your old zoning ordinance or your current zoning ordinance that's to become your unified development code has the old terms in it from your previous thoroughfare plan. We've updated it to talk about collectors and minor arterials and expressways and streets of that nature. We've also provided clarity for block length. This is maybe kind of a mundane thing, but it's also important. The shorter the block length, the more walkable an area tends to be, just because and also the more drivable it can be, because you have more than one way to get from point A to point B. If it's a maze of cul-de-sacs that have a ton of dead ends, then you might have to drive very circuitously or walk very circuitously to get to one point to the other, that as the crow flies, they might be very close to each other. But, the serpentine kind of suburban style streets can cause you to have to drive a long way. So in certain areas, especially as you can see the mixed use districts, we have a short block length to help enable more of a grid layout of streets, as opposed to something that would be more suburban. And that's fine still in the suburban areas, of course, but trying to shorten that block length over in the mixed use districts. And that is, I'll go back, that is tied to, all of these are tied to parts of your comprehensive plan, but I do have a little quote in there from your comprehensive plan that talks about considering having shorter block lengths. There are also rules in their subdivision standards about cul-de-sacs. We've kept the maximum length of a cul-de-sac to 600 feet and shown a little more clearly how to measure it. As you can see in the graphic in the upper right, we emphasize coordination with the fire department on any cul-de-sac that might exceed that 600-foot length. And we prohibit them, as you might imagine, in the mixed-use districts where we're going more for a grid layout. Easements are a big part of the subdivision standards. Water, wastewater. We've provided minimum widths for those types of easements, depending on how big the pipe is that's going underground. Required under certain circumstances, cross-access easements in order to cut down on the number of driveways or curb cuts along a street. The state is in control of many of your streets, but these standards would apply on local streets that Lubbock maintains and has control of. For sidewalks, we again reference the master thoroughfare plan for how wide they would be and where they would be located. And we allow trail plans to be substituted instead of sidewalks where there might be larger lots developed and it might be cost prohibitive to do sidewalks, and just make more sense to allow some type of trail system instead as a way for pedestrian activity to take place.
Okay, let's pause right there for
Yeah.
a minute. Questions around subdivision standards, comments? So Brian, do I understand that, well, let's talk about alleys, okay?
Mhm.
The way I read it, alleys may be paved, is what it says. It also talks about the sort of the entry to the alley is required to be paved. What's the, and maybe I may have missed it. It's a lot of, it's just not my business, but what are we requiring for alleys from a construction standpoint?
Sure. I don't have the benefit of looking at my draft right now, but Lubbock is a little unusual. I think it might be more common in West Texas than you would see in other parts of the state, where there are lots of developments, even rather new ones, with both alleys and front-loaded, front driveways. And so at first in the draft, I believe, if I'm remembering right, when we started on module 3, we kind of had it as an either or, because that's sort of what I think we were used to. Either you have front access or you have alley access, and not both. The draft now, in talking with staff and being more adapted to Lubbock's way of doing things, currently has both, basically, where there are alleys allowed for the rear of properties, because I believe your sanitation uses them, and front driveways. It is correct that in the draft, I believe there is a may there for paving rather than a shall. And I thought that might be a carryover of what you currently do, but I could be
No, it is,
mistaken.
but it's a problem. And it's a place we need to have a discussion, because the fact that we don't require, and I'm not advocating for requiring paving, but I think we've got to do something other than the dirt that was there previously.
Yeah.
It's a cost. The cost of nonconformance on that is huge. Our phones ring every time. They more than ring every time we have a rain. You can imagine what happens over time in our unimproved alleys. And so I know this council is very interested in, I would imagine planning and zoning is also, in something that would require, as long as we're going to pick up trash in alleys, we're going to have to improve those alleys to the point that they allow for that traffic.
Yeah, and it could be that something like just a more broader, like all-weather surface term be used, and we could define what that means, of course. And it might already be defined in the definitions. Which
I looked for something under paved alleys. I didn't find anything,
Okay.
but I think concrete would be a mistake, because we find our utilities, constantly running up and down these alleys doing with their subcontractor doing what they do. But we got to find something that helps us as we go forward. It would be a mistake to not improve upon the situation we find ourselves in today.
Okay. Definitely note that. Moving on, if that's okay. One more piece from White and Smith on environmental management, specifically Playa Lakes.
So, yeah, we're talking about this here. Really interesting feature that really just a West Texas thing, not an East Texas thing, not a Central Texas thing, but a West Texas thing. I know the comp plan talked a lot about Playa Lakes, what the city can do to manage the effects of Playa Lakes. So I propose in this draft kind of having a buffer system around Playa Lakes that prevent permitted development, but still allowed like recreational uses, like, fish or, sightseeing, whatnot. There's two types of buffers specified, and different uses are allowed within those. Nothing like, no heavy construction or anything like we will see in the commercial area or the fire lake to kind of protect the fire lake and kind of the effects of rain in areas. Next slide, Brian. And then kind of proposing a system that the city can kind of keep track of fire lakes and making requirements on site plans to identify fire lakes, what's going on in the area to better regulate effects from fire lakes when it comes to the development. With that being said, it's a brief spiel of fire lake regulation documents.
Okay. I'll keep going if that's all right with you, Mr. Mayor.
Anything on environmental? Okay, please continue.
And really,
Oh, excuse, I'm sorry, Mr. Chattis. One.
Thank you. Question on the Playa Lakes, construction or permitting if they want to start some type of rental equipment. Has that been discussed? Is that part of it?
So rental equipment, like
Yeah, that's what you're talking about. Yes.
that's what you're talking about.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, we can look a little bit more in detail. I think that would be something that would be acceptable given how much violates.
We already have stored.
What violates in the area. I think that's something we can look at, definitely discuss with staff, see what the coverage is regarding those types of kind of like recreation.
Thank you, Mr. Atkinson. You have something to add to that?
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, council member. Gentlemen, just might note that the city does have a process to allow concessionaires to operate on the sides of the lakes, the lake shores and so forth. Basically, they're using temporary structures. Seems to work very well. And if understanding the question, we would want to be sure we can maintain that access and not be in violation of our own codes.
Exactly.
And we've defined certain lakes, right? Do I recall that? And based upon the size park, is that right?
We
Regional
do,
parks
we do today have,
Yeah.
right now it's basically the canyon lakes. We know there's interest potentially in others, so might want to maintain that option.
Thank you.
Okay. Really, we're about to wrap up on this PowerPoint. In the end, when this is all said and done and adopted, you're going to have a very web-ready, state-of-the-art, I would say, unified development code that is native to the internet, native to online, has a ton of usable features for people so that they can kind of work on figuring out answers to them for themselves to certain very simple questions, and not necessarily tie up as much staff time as one benefit of many. Having clickable cross-references where it says refer to section 300 for parking requirements. The person looking at the code clicks that, it jumps right to that section that's being referred to. Having definitions, when the term Playa Lake shows up, they hover over that term and a bubble pops up showing what that defined term means. According to the UDC, having lots of illustrations, lots of tools for people to use really to make their development, make them as smart as they can be about what they're going to get into when they want to do some type of development here. And finally, that final bullet, a linked map. What we mean by that is your zoning map will be linked to the text of the Unified Development Code so that And the details will remain to be ironed out, but basically they talk to each other where districts on the map interface with the written words that are in the Unified Development Code. We have some next steps to show you, which are revisions to Module 3 based on this visit that we're having right now and that we had yesterday, and we'll wrap up tomorrow. Trying to get those done as much as we can by the week of April 5th coming up. And then publication of Module 4. So just like the previous 3 modules, at the first week or so of the month, we've published the module as they currently stand. So January, it was Module 1, February, Module 2, March was Module 3, and first week of April, we'll have Module 4 published on the site for the Unified Development Code so that the public can view it. We've also been providing a one-page sort of cheat sheet for each of the modules to give you a one-page summary of what's in there. So you can kind of refer to that as you're going through it. And then not quite sure on the exact date, but we will have another site visit for Module 4, similar to this one, probably late April timeframe. If the project, is extended more, then that would change, of course. But sometime around there, we would have one more site visit, or not one more, but the next site visit. So that really wraps up what I have to say. And I guess I can sit down and we can take questions if there are any others.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So I'm sure we'll have some questions. Before we go to that, Mr. Isom, any comments that you or Ms. Sager would like to make? You're good. You're good with that? Okay. Any other staff? Any other staff comments? Okay. I'll turn to my right. P&Z, what do y'all think? What are your thoughts about where we are? And I'm curious who wants to start? Dan, you want to go first?
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have some general questions just for clarity for me. As these modules are developed, you made a comment earlier that they are then passed to staff. And so just for general clarification for myself, as these modules are passed to staff, is staff, Brian, I guess this may be a question for you, is staff at that point vetting the modules that have been submitted to you and your staff? And what I mean by that, are we as a staff taking the time to actually read through here, not necessarily to pick it apart, but to try to understand what is written on each page?
Sure. So what we've been doing is we have a staff technical advisory committee, which is made up of folks from the engineering department, parks and recreation, planning, building safety, code enforcement, and we vet these modules through each group. And then as additional groups need additional help, engineering might bring in more of their stormwater team to review some of the subdivision regulations and ply lakes and things like that. So we're trying to vet them through our different departments, additional stakeholders that we can meet with. But then we come back after we submit our comments to Candid Keys. And then part of each site visit is a staff technical advisory committee meeting, which means they meet individually with us after we've given them comments. They attempt to address the comments. And then if there's some ones that they need more follow-up with, they come back and meet with staff in person. We go through those comments again. I know on Module 3, I think we had probably 3 or 4 total staff meetings. That was a very complicated module with all the subdivision regs. But that's typically the process that we follow.
Okay.
Brett Keast, I would just like to compliment your staff. We do this work all over the country, and you'd be surprised at the amount of times that staff is kind of peripherally involved. Your staff is very much involved. We've had over 2,000 comments that have come into Encode Plus. So this code has been very well vetted, multiple rounds, lots of back and forth, answering questions and making sure that we understand the nature of the question and are getting it right. So your staff is there to be applauded. They've done a bang up job in terms of many, many hours. So they've done a fantastic job.
Then is the module also vetted by legal at the same time? Okay, I'm just making sure I've got all the boxes checked in my mind. And the reason I'm asking is because Plan 2040 required certain things and asked for certain things. Council granted that. It was adopted. Now we're in the middle of the UDC. And when I read these pages, and number one, let me say, I appreciate all the work you're doing on this. We have operated under what some would consider an antiquated situation for many years. And so we're not reinventing the wheel, but we're improving the wheel by what you guys are submitting to us. So any of my comments tonight are not to be taken in a negative context, okay? I'd like to compliment you on what you're doing. I'd like to compliment the city and the leadership of the city for being able to look forward and say, we need a new system. I have been a member of this commission for many years, and I cannot tell you the controversies we've had by simply trying to interpret the system that we've operated under for many years. Mm-hmm. Your system will provide some clarity. At the same time, me being a layman, I'm a developer, I'm a builder, and I'm reading through some of this, and I don't completely understand everything I'm reading due to terminologies, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm just trying to make sure that each module has been dissected to the point that everyone can understand to avoid a situation in the future where this UDC in its entirety gets voted on and adopted by council and then given to the public to use. And then we hit a situation where we have stakeholders or investors saying, I don't understand who would vote for this, because change brings that. And Terry Holman made a comment earlier that I'm gonna chime in with his comment. And that is, right now, the engineering firms in town that work with developers and builders are working double overtime, simply trying to meet requests from developers to get subdivisions and plats recorded, et cetera, because here comes impact fees. Mm-hmm. And every employee of every engineering firm in this town is working incredible overtime. At the same time, those are the groups of people that actually need to be reading through here too and creating their questions. I brought a 3-ring binder with me this evening of simply modules 1 and 2. Have 190 questions just out of 2 modules. Do we have time to address that? It's hard to find time because we're all so busy, but yet it's mandatory that we do. And some of these, it's simply a question for clarity. Once you answer those questions, everybody's going to go, oh, I understand what you mean. But some of your terminologies we're not familiar with. And so here goes a question mark on that particular comment. And so I'm not trying to slow the train down. But what I am intending to do is to let everyone know that for this to be right and for it to be understood within this community, because it is so different than what we've ever operated under, that we're going to need that time to vet this through our developers council, through our builders, through our investors, through the commercial guys. And it's hard to do right now with the level of work that everyone's doing because of other things that are on the plate, like impact fees, et cetera, And I'm not sitting here tonight advocating that we move our finish date, but I am saying it is a possibility we may ask for that. We may need to, just because this is complex. Until you get involved in it and begin to understand it. First reading, it feels complex.
Yeah, from the very beginning, we've told staff from the point we were selected that we bring to this a philosophy of having done this 200 times all across the country. And when you say simplify an ordinance, most minds would say, oh, great, we're going to have a 50-page ordinance. But in our work with developers and folks like yourself all across the country, the expectation is that things are well written, they're articulate, they're illustrated, and they don't leave a lot of void, they don't leave a lot of question, and they don't leave too much discretion to where they can't read the ordinance and have any idea what the cities expect. So we're trying to write the ordinance. Indeed, it's longer, indeed it's different, intentionally so, but trying to be very articulate and working with you to say, here are the 10 things that are required if you want to do A. If you want to do B, here are the 12 things that are required. So that whether they're sitting in Dallas or they're sitting in Phoenix, and they're coming here to develop, They can read that code and say, I can see where the bar is set. I understand that. The process is clear. And the two most important words I can tell you are certainty and predictability. That you don't want to spend a lot of time on a process that might take you 6 or 9 months negotiating every term if it's at the end of the day, the development that we all agree on is good. So why did we just do that? So if we can spell that out, and that's why we're trying to give you options of saying we're not requiring you to do A, B, or C, but we're telling you A, B, and C are all available within that zoning district. Pandemic comes, housing bubble bursts, things change, interest rates change. You don't want to be tied up for the next 4 months going through a zoning change because now you can't build what you're going to. You want to do smaller lots of smaller houses. You're able to do all that in the same district without going back through the process, but all the standards are spelled out clearly. So we welcome the opportunity to, you're exactly right. Usually once we explain it and we talk through it, then the light bulbs click on and everybody goes, I understand now. But Mr. Mark White wrote an ordinance when I worked for the city of Olathe, Kansas. And I would say it probably took our staff about a year before we felt comfortable of knowing where everything was at. When a developer walked in, we could flip it open and say, here's the requirement. It takes time. And we had conversations today about, how does the community educate folks? Probably 80 or 85% of people that live in Lubbock probably won't ever have the occasion to open this book unless they're building a garage, and they're probably going to be represented by somebody. So that leaves the folks like yourself, the builder, the realtors, the brokers, the developers, the landowners, downtown business owners, other business owners. There's a certain group of people, so unlike the comp plan where it's got to come one, come all, there's a smaller group of people that have the interest in the technical. I know everybody sitting here is most definitely has a great interest because you're administering this along with staff. So we don't take any offense. The more comments we get, indeed, it's a lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of hours. But the code is better at the end of the day for it.
It's taking a lot of hours. And I want to say, I commend you guys because you have been responsive. You have fielded questions or concerns or even misunderstandings, and you have been responsive to that. There will be more dumb questions from us people that don't understand some of this that you're trying to accomplish. Yeah, it's kind of like making sausage. If you go through a sausage plant, you promise yourself you're never eating it again. But yet at the end of the day, when you cook it and taste it, it's pretty good. And so we're kind of in the middle of the sausage plant right now.
I always hear, don't tell me about the labor pains, just show me the baby.
That's right. Thank you.
Dan, I think your comments are spot on. I think the council appreciates that very much. I think we took action maybe a month or so ago to make certain that we understand it, much like I think our stakeholders want to understand it. And I appointed a 3-member council committee that's doing a deep dive as this goes along. It's Ms. Joy's leading that group along with Mr. Christian and Mr. Griffith. I'm gonna let Latrell just talk for a minute about what they're doing and what their process is and how that's coming along.
Yeah, this all got started before the committee was appointed. So what we are doing is we're doing the deep dive, Dan, that you're talking about. And yes, some of the terminology has changed, which has made it hard for those of us who are used to talking about, CV and R1 and R1A and R2. But I think we're getting there. We met today for about the 3rd or 4th time. And there's an exchange of information. Now, none of us on the committee are planners, okay? But we have the practical experience that you guys bring to us when you hit those tough issues. And so we're working really hard. And you've already spoken to simplify, but if we can't spell it out in a way that someone can pick it up and understand it, then we've lost the concept. I agree with the comments about timing. We need much more time on this. There's an element of this that not only are we understanding, but we have to get with all of those people who also need to understand, and we need to do it before it gets back to council to adopt. And that educational part of it is very important. Fine, we think we have a product that we can live with, but we've got to meet with all of those groups and all the people who have the interest to make sure that it's going to work. Because remember, this is about the citizens of the city of Lubbock. That's what it's about. And we've got to protect them. We don't want to do this again. We do want very much to get it right. And so I would expect that our committee is going to come back and ask that we not try to do this by June. We can't do it by June. It is physically impossible to do it. And so my committee, Mr. Griffith, Mr. Christian, we've all been attentive, we've all been reading, we've all been crossing out, asking probably sometimes some stupid questions. But you know, sometimes a stupid question leads you to something really important. So whatever questions you have, don't consider them stupid. Just go ahead and let it.
Just tell them about me.
Yeah. And I will tell you that we are looking at the downtown public improvement design standards as well. And I heard some talk about that today. So we're also looking at those. So bear with us, but please ask questions. If you want to know something, Brian's available. He's pretty busy. The consultants are good to answer those questions. And to the extent that as committee members we can, we'll be happy to do that. But this is an important project. Remember when we did the comprehensive plan? We did that for 18 months. And right at the end of it, we got people who were more interested because they hadn't been engaged. That's not the way we want this to work. We want that engagement to be during the process and not at the end. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Joy. I think maybe we're on the same page there. Okay. Other P&Z comments? Okay. All right. Thank you. We really appreciate you guys and your work there. Okay, council. Mr. Patterson Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm just going to kind of echo what everybody else was saying. I made myself a note to say, God dog it, we're barreling down the street at a high rate of speed. And it's like there's still so much that we need to get done. My question is, I get concerned when we don't hear or don't take in the information from so many citizens. While we may think that some folks may never be concerned, they will be. Somebody's going to need a carport. I think somebody's going to need a whole lot of things, and that they may have to do themselves, that they want to make sure that they understand. My question is, what cooperation or integration is there with the CPAC Oversight Committee in conjunction with this? Because these are citizens who come from a lot of different areas within the community. They have the opportunity to engage other folks in the community, and they can bring some things back, I believe, when we would not hear otherwise. I think if we don't get out and start hearing and almost forcing people to engage with us, they've been out of sync with that because COVID has hit us in the back closet. And so they're out of sync with that. So it's going to take us doing everything we can to make sure that we're getting folks engaged and involved, and that we hear from them before, because it ain't cute when we start hearing from them afterwards. And that's what the situation has been. I got some notes here because I want to sit this right here as we go through this thing. Just like was stated earlier, I am concerned about those older parts of the city. And I know that the gentleman on the screen had said that he would get back to that when Mr. Schweiker asked that question, and I don't think he did. I'm concerned as to how do we do these things? How do we transition? How do we make things well and not be too harsh and make things better for those older areas of the city? Because we're making it good and cute for the newer parts, but there's still some other folks living in some areas that we need to bear in mind. So that's my deal. I'm excited about what we're doing. I heard the folks about the community gardens, and where do we put that? How do we make that fit so that citizens are allowed to do some things that they'd like to do? I will go back and say, I wish that we would incorporate the oversight committee to engage in this process a whole lot more and continue to think about those older areas and places in the city. You mentioned 34th Street, Mr. Mayor, and that is very important. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Yeah, so two questions out of that. Let's start, Brian, with how's the CPOC, how's the oversight committee engaged? And then I'll go to the consultants to talk about the community garden piece.
Sure. So I think we got the direction from council at one of the most recent meetings to start engaging with them more. Typically, we meet with them once a quarter. We've pushed that up now to once a month. And what we're doing is presenting module by module to our CPOC team, and they're giving us some very good feedback. And we're taking that back to the table and back to our consultants. One of the most recent ones from our recent meeting with them was the small incremental mixed use in the existing neighborhoods, and how is that something that we look into, and how do we make that achievable? So that's something we're taking back to our consultants. But yes, we are engaging with them. And if you have any guidance on how to reach out to the rest of the community, please. We're doing our best, but we're not hearing from people sometimes, and we'll continue to push it. But
I have some guidance. You gotta go find them. You gotta meet people where they are. And like I said, COVID has had us tucked away. And this is such an important event that we have to kind of lead the way in that thing and get to folks. I have a whole bunch of tennis shoes, and I don't mind using them to begin to make sure that we get to folks. But I think it's very important that we do that. Thank you.
I think you're right. But people have to engage too. I mean, we had a really well done event last night. We had about 40 citizens engage, and there are people that they're passionate about it. But we want to hear all the voices. Let's talk about these community gardens for a minute. What are your thoughts, Brian? You want to talk about that, or sure. Okay, please.
So community gardens are, I think people maybe know what they are, but in case they don't, they would be sort of as the name sounds, a garden set aside more in a neighborhood residential area where people can grow fruits and vegetables and use them for their own use. Not a commercial activity, really. You're not selling what you're growing there. So they are allowed as a permitted use, as has been mentioned in the estate district. And then they're also permitted, but subject to certain specific standards specific to community gardens in the other residential districts and in the mixed use district and in the neighborhood commercial district, which is the least intense commercial district, the one that's sort of meant to be adjacent to residentials or maybe on the corner of a residential area. And so that's sort of how it's laid out as far as where it's permitted. Some of the standards, and I think it's been said, so I don't know if I want to repeat it. I think the main standard that might have been objections to are buffering, where we are saying in the draft that a buffer yard is required on the community gardens property between the bulk of the community garden itself and an abutting residential area, basically. And a buffer yard would consist of a certain width, of landscaped area and plantings, trees, basically, in that buffer yard. And so that is, there to try to protect protect, I guess, the adjacent residential use. There's an option to, if we want to at least, if nothing else, ratchet that buffer down one level to a skinnier buffer with fewer trees required within it. If we want, we could potentially remove that requirement. Like I said, this is a draft and can always be changed until it's adopted. That seemed like the main thing. The other standards specifically for community gardens that would apply are kind of maybe taken care of in a lot of other places in the code, saying you can't have light trespass onto the neighboring properties, which you really shouldn't be doing anyway, that the stormwater is under control, that there aren't nuisances that could be related to growing food on a site, rodents or other pests like that. And then there's a provision related to how big of a shed they could have for tool storage and things of that nature. Sure. So it feels like maybe the buffer might be the biggest part, and Brett wanted to say something.
We've encountered this quite a lot as we work around the country. You have places like Cleveland that's over 40% of their local food supplies grown in community gardens and in backyards. So you've got this is a growing issue. Boston's doing a lot. There's a lot of cities all over the country that are doing this, but it's not just totally unregulated. They are very good in older neighborhoods where you may have a missing lot or missing home. Yeah. And rather than being grown over, if it's not well maintained, it's a perfect spot for a community garden. It's very walkable. But in most cases, there are setbacks and there are some things like that just to make sure that it's well maintained and it's an asset to the neighborhood. The buffer yard could be fruit trees, it could be other things like that. So you just have to think logically about how can these happen, where could they happen, how big can they be, and then how are they maintained over the course of a long time. I've seen beautiful community gardens and I've seen overrun weed community gardens. So I think we all agree on what we'd like to see in Lubbock. So that's the reason for, and those limited use standards, as long as they're demonstrated, can be approved by staff. It doesn't have to be elevated all the way up to council to address a community garden. That's the purpose.
I think we all agree on that. Have you guys had a chance to do a drive-by and see some of our community gardens?
Brian may have, I have not, but I wrote down the ones that were listed today, so I wanted to do that.
Yeah, maybe when you're back, we can do a little drive around. We'll go together and look at some of them. I think it'd be interesting to get a feel for that. And I think the buffering, that's something we need to talk about. How, it needs to be. I completely agree. There needs to be a buffer for a lot of reasons, but I think it's something that we should try to apply best of breed to. And I'm glad you guys have a lot of experience with it. I think we can get there. Okay.
Keeping the cost reasonable. You don't want a group of neighbors to get together and have to spend $20,000 on a fence because it's not going to happen. So we have to try to figure out where to draw that line.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Joy.
I wanted to respond to one of the requests from Dan, not Dan Pope, the other Dan. You asked about if legal was involved in this. Yes. Kelly Leisure. Kelly, why don't you stand up? She meets with us every time we meet, and she meets with everybody, the other committees when they meet. And so she is the go-to. There's a whole legal department behind her that she is going through all these modules. She's making corrections. She's sending them back. She's making comments and sending them back. So yes, I want you to know that yes, they are very much involved. We couldn't do it without them. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Other comments or questions? I don't want to not consider the other citizen feedback we heard today. You guys got that notes on that too. We'll make sure you get a copy of that written feedback so you have that. But I think there was the other things that were mentioned seem to be pretty logical kind of a potential adjustments. Sure, please. Mr. Wilson.
One of the points that came out of 2040 plan was, and it's been touched on tonight, was the fact of a neighborhood plan. What do we do with the older neighborhoods? Let's try to revive the older neighborhoods with some type of neighborhood planning. We now have on staff a neighborhood planner. And so here again, just for clarity from my mind, I would presume that that person also is involved in this process. Because if we have an individual that's on staff that is being creative to come up with different neighborhood plans, I would presume they're going to be fluent in this language and in this document. Am I correct?
Mr. Isom, can you talk to that, please?
I got lots of mic too, but yes, he will be. And I wrote a note down and talked to Kristen that we need to work with Wilson as he's going out into this neighborhood to help get people more engaged with this code. So he's sitting right over here.
Yeah, he's taking copious notes. Yeah.
We didn't have, 4 months ago, but we do have that we can use to help, as Councilwoman Patterson Harris said, engage the community. So yes, he's going to be very fluent in it, as will all of our staff.
Yeah, great point.
Wilson, I was not picking on you.
Yes, you were.
He's sitting back there saying, "Oh my gosh, Dan's talking again."
At least it's what you did that Dan instead of this Dan. That's what most people are saying. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Okay. So I think in conclusion, first of all, a big thanks to our consultants and to our staff. Thank you for what you're doing. A thanks to our subcommittee of the council that's running this, to our stakeholders that this means a lot to. We've got to hear from you, okay? And your point, Dan, was well made. A big thanks to the Planning and Zoning Commission. I think as much as you guys are being worked, we need to double your pay. If we can fit that in the budget, Mr. Atkinson, you think we can do that? Triple, Mr. Bell. Yeah. We will be back to do this again relatively soon. Mr. Weaver, Ms. Garza, Mr. Atkinson, anything from you guys? Okay, good. Any other staff, anything from, okay. All right, I'll let you adjourn.
All right, adjourn.
City Council's adjourned. It's 6:58.
What? No gavel? I'll go upstairs and get it.